Welcome again to the University of Nottingham, and today I have Dr. Carly Crouch with me, who is going to try and answer the question, why study the Hebrew Bible? Hello, Carly.
Hello.
Hebrew Bible, what is it?
The Hebrew Bible, which is sometimes known as the Old Testament in the Christian context, is a collection of books mostly written in Hebrew, as the name would suggest, which derive from a very long time ago, almost 2,500 years ago, in the area which is the modern Middle East, mostly in what's now Israel. And it's a collection of books which relate to all aspects of human life and which talk about the relationship between human beings and their God.
Tell me, the word Hebrew Bible is a phrase that one hears in academic circles, but most people would just refer to the Old Testament. Can you tease out the difference between what's conceptually in the notion of Old Testament and what's conceptually in the notion of Hebrew Bible?
Well, the term Old Testament is a term which is used in relation to these texts in their Christian context. So when you speak of the Old Testament, you're implicitly assuming that there's a New Testament to go with it, and these are the texts which precede that New Testament. When you use the term Hebrew Bible, you're looking at these texts on their own, without assuming that there are any later traditions, a new revelation which follows on from them.
So when you use the word, why study the Hebrew Bible, you're saying, let's focus on these texts as they exist insofar as you can construct an original time frame for them.
Yes, for the most part. I personally work very much on the Hebrew Bible as a historical text, and the Hebrew Bible in its ancient Near Eastern context. So trying to use these texts to help reconstruct history and events in history and people and politics and society, and to try and understand what the world was like in that ancient context.
Now, if I were to turn to the Hebrew Bible as a guide to the ancient Near East and a guide to how a community understood its relationship to its God, where would you suggest that I start reading?
There's a lot of different places you could start reading.
That's why I'm asking the question.
Inevitable. Well, one place you might start is in the prophetic books, which are individual texts within the Hebrew Bible attributed to a prophetic figure. So someone who is in the role of an intermediary, someone who helps human beings communicate with God and helps God communicate with human beings. And in the prophetic books, there's a great deal of discussion and talk about what it means for human beings to be in relationship with their God and what it is that their God requires of human beings.
When I go and I read an ancient text, and you say, I'm reading a text from 2,500 years ago, what are the main problems that I, living in today's world, have when I pick up that text? And let's assume that I'm reading the Hebrew Bible, but I'm reading it in English. Now I pick up the text. What are the main difficulties that will confront me and that will create barriers between me and that text?
Well, one thing is your everyday experience with what life is like. So, for example, this morning on our way to the studio, think about how many people we saw. There was dozens, perhaps even hundreds.
At least hundreds, yeah.
At least hundreds coming through a average-sized city. But in the ancient world, all of those people that we saw just this morning might constitute all of the people you ever saw in your entire life. And so the concerns and the issues that you would have to deal with on a daily basis are very different to the kinds of issues that we have to deal with today. Very much more issues of survival and continuing your family and making sure that your family is safe.
Because these are effectively subsistence farmers living in tiny villages.
Yes, for the most part.
I think most people who have looked at the Hebrew Bible down the centuries, whether they've called it the Old Testament or they've looked at it as a collection of ancient Hebrew writings, have seen it almost, well, first of all, they've put it in the category of sacred book and therefore distinct from everything else. How does the Hebrew Bible relate to the cultures around it? Like, is it a completely isolated phenomenon, or do we see influences from Egypt down to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, to other places?
We see an enormous amount of influence, and that's been one of the really interesting things in studying the Hebrew Bible in the last 100 years or so, because we've made enormous discoveries about life in Egypt, about life in Mesopotamia, in Assyria and Babylonia, which have been incredibly insightful in looking at the kind of influences and similarities and relationship between things which we have in the Hebrew Bible and which we find elsewhere in the ancient Near East. So everything, for example, from ideas about how the world is created to ideas about moral wisdom and legal ideas.
So, for instance, I think, is that, are you saying basically that if I were to look at something like the Code of Hammurabi from Mesopotamia, I will find overlaps between that and the legal prescriptions that one reads in the Hebrew Bible?
Yes, there is a lot of overlap in the legal material we find in the Hebrew Bible.
There's one story in the Hebrew Bible that everyone knows, and of course that is the Genesis narratives. There's the fabulous Genesis narrative in what we'll roughly call chapter 1 of the 7 days, and then there's the even more elaborate narrative in the second and third chapters, the Adam and Eve story. Can you just say a few words about the Adam and Eve story and the ancient Near East?
Well, that's interesting because the Adam and Eve story in chapters 2 and 3 are the version of creation in Genesis, which there are actually much fewer ancient Near Eastern parallels for. There are some similarities in that Adam and Eve or at least Adam is made initially from the dust, and also that there's this idea that there's some divine element in Adam and then humanity as a whole. And those kinds of features are witnessed elsewhere in the ancient Near East, that human beings either made of clay or then have an element of the divine in them. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, the divine element is blood rather than breath, but you get the same sort of idea that there's something about human beings which is related to the divine.
Now, someone listening to this is going to immediately say, well, Adam and Eve, they never existed, it's not history. What's the answer? Like, what do you say to someone who says it's not history?
Well, I would say that we need to think about, were they ever intended as history? So the narratives in Genesis, the creation stories, the interesting thing about them is that, especially if you look at them in their ancient Near Eastern context, and you start to see the way that they're different from other similar stories about creation in the ancient Near East, you start to realize that part of what those narratives are doing is trying to make theological statements. So, for example, in Genesis 1's creation story about God creating the heavens and earth out of the darkness and the void, you get a very strong sense in Genesis 1 when you look at it compared to other Genesis type creation stories in the ancient Near East, that God is the only God in Genesis 1 story, whereas the similar narratives in the ancient Near East have other gods that the chief god have to fight against in order to become the chief god and to create the world. Whereas in Genesis 1, we have a narrative that says, no, there are no other gods. God, our God, is the only God and has no opposition in creating the world. So it's making a theological statement rather than necessarily trying to make a historical statement. And that kind of theological statement can still be of interest with or without the historical
Listening
background.
to you, it seems to me that you don't suggest that these stories can be just taken over directly into a modern day narrative, but that by looking at the different narratives, one sees how religious narratives work, and the interest is more in seeing how these people construct theological statements than in just importing them into one's own theological narrative.
Yes, I think that's right. It's very much a process of trying to understand what about the biblical text, about the Hebrew Bible, is distinctive, and what is it that they're trying to do in these texts. What's the really key point that we then, if you would like to apply,
One final question. I have now decided I want to read a piece of text, and this piece of text will introduce me to some of the problems. Putting you on the spot, what text am I going to pick?
Genesis wouldn't be a bad place to start.
Okay, I thought you'd pick something far more obscure.
Well, there's Song of Songs if you want something a little bit more obscure, which is wonderful and beautiful poetry, and many people don't know it's in the Hebrew Bible.
You know, I think I would rather read the Song of Songs than Genesis 1 or anything in Genesis. Carly, thank you very much.